Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a small wooden vessel in the year 1820. The sea around you is a restless sheet of grey, rolling and dipping beneath a sky so heavy with cloud it seems to press down on the world. The wind cuts at your cheeks, sharper than any you felt before, and the boards beneath your boots are slick with a thin crust of frozen spray. You look ahead, and there, far on the horizon, a shape begins to rise. It isn't land as you know it. It's something else, a wall of white, too vast to measure, too still to be mere weather. A place the maps call Terra Australis, the great southern land, though no one can truly say what lies beyond.
Good evening. You're listening to Boring Boris, boring history for sleep, where silence builds slowly, like snow on an untouched drift, and the stories settle into place as the night wears on. Tonight, we'll walk through the forgotten history of Antarctic exploration, not as a race or a headline, but as the quiet footsteps of those who went where no one should have and stayed as long as they could bear. So settle in and let the ice close gently around us.
They called it the edge of the map, not as a flourish of speech, but because, in truth, that is where it lay. To reach this place meant days, weeks, even months of sailing southward, until the familiar stars were lost to a sky that seemed unfamiliar in its very pattern. The sun, too, behaved differently, rising and falling at strange angles, then at certain times refusing to rise at all. Mariners spoke of waters that boiled with unseen currents, of fogs so thick the ship's prow vanished into them, and of seas that could crush a hull without warning. For many, these were enough to turn back, but for some, driven by curiosity, ambition, or sheer stubbornness, they were only reasons to push further. In those early years, the world's understanding of Antarctica was little more than a patchwork of myths, guesses, and the occasional fragment of truth. The ancient Greeks had imagined a great southern land as a balance to the continents of the north, believing the earth required symmetry. Medieval mapmakers filled the blank spaces with sweeping coastlines and ornate creatures, their quills guided as much by imagination as by fact. And even in the age of sail, when the seas grew busier with trade and empire, the far south remained an almost mythical notion, a place beyond reason where the natural order might not apply. Ships that ventured too far into those latitudes sometimes returned with tales of islands wreathed in ice,
of mountains like frozen cathedrals, and of waters so littered with white fragments they seemed to carry the sky upon their surface. Yet these same stories spoke of men driven half mad by weeks without a horizon, of compasses that spun without cause, and of the peculiar silence that fell over a crew when the winds dropped and only the groan of ice against wood remained. To the listener in a warm tavern, such accounts might sound like exaggeration. To the men who lived them, they were simply the facts of the place. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, national pride had entered the equation. Britain, Russia, France, and later the United States began to see the southern polar regions not merely as curiosities, but as potential territories, or, at the very least, as prizes in the ongoing game of proving one's supremacy at sea. Official expeditions were launched under the banners of science and discovery, yet the journals of their leaders reveal an undercurrent of competition. Each sighting of land or ice was meticulously recorded, each chart carefully guarded. It was not enough to explore, one had to be first. Still, for all their ambition, these expeditions were fragile things. Ships were designed for storms, but not for the constant grinding pressure of ice. Provisions could be planned for months, but not for the delays that came when passages froze shut. A single error in navigation could set a crew hundreds of miles off course, with no friendly port to correct their path. The early Antarctic explorers lived at the mercy of a continent that, even in their absence, was perfectly content to remain unseen. And yet they came. Not in the dozens as with later ventures, but in small, determined groups. Sealers, chasing the lucrative pelts that could fetch fortunes in Europe and America. Whalers, seeking the rich grounds where their prey gathered in the cold seas. And, increasingly, state-sponsored voyages, their decks carrying scientists who peered through brass instruments, sketched coastlines, and recorded temperatures with fingers stiffened by cold. These were the first true steps towards understanding Antarctica. Hesitant, often reluctant, but steps nonetheless. It is easy, from the warmth of the present, to view these early efforts as primitive. The maps they drew are laughably incomplete, their instruments rudimentary by modern standards, their ships slow and underpowered. Yet there is something to be said for the resolve it took to face such a place with so little in hand. Every mile south was a mile further from rescue. Every day in the ice was a day borrowed against luck. And still they pressed on, compelled by reasons that were never entirely clear, even to themselves.
Perhaps it was the allure of the blank space, the idea that in an age when the world seems smaller with each voyage, there still remains somewhere vast and untouched. Perhaps it was the hope of discovery, of finding a resource or a passage that would change the fortunes of a nation. Or perhaps it was simply the nature of exploration itself. To go, because not going would mean admitting the limits of one's courage. Whatever the reason, the edge of the map began to shift. Each voyage added a line here, an inlet there, a note about the wind or the lay of the ice. What had once been the stuff of rumor slowly became the province of record. But the more they learned, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary frontier. Antarctica was not a place to be tamed or claimed. It was and would remain a place apart, a continent whose true nature could not be captured on paper, but only endured in person. And so, standing on that deck in the pale southern light, the early explorer looked not at a land waiting to be won, but at a vastness that made all human ambition seem very small indeed. The edge of the map was no longer an ending. It was the beginning of a new kind of journey, one measured not in miles gained, but in the willingness to keep going when every sensible instinct said to turn back.
Imagine yourself sitting at a worn oak table in a candle-lit room somewhere in London, Paris, or St. Petersburg in the early 19th century. Around you, the air is heavy with tobacco smoke and the low murmur of voices. Maps are spread across the table, vast sheets of parchment inked with coastlines that trail off into nothing. Seas that fade into blank white space. A finger traces downward from the known waters of the Southern Ocean, past the scattered islands marked by earlier voyages, and stops at the great empty stretch labeled Terra Australis Incognita.
This was the unknown that pulled men south. Not a specific treasure, nor a guarantee of profit, but the tantalizing promise of being the one to fill that void on the map. Some were drawn by science, to study the peculiar weather, the strange wildlife, the geology of a land untouched by human settlement. Others were drawn by pride, knowing that a first sighting or a successful landing could bring fame, favor, and perhaps a knighthood. And then there were those for whom the lure was more personal, the chance to be remembered in an age when the world's blank spaces were vanishing fast. The myths about the southern continent had been around for centuries, but by the late 1700s
there were tangible motives that could be written into official orders. Sealing was one of them. The pelts of Antarctic fur seals were so valuable in China and Europe that a single successful voyage could make a captain wealthy for life. Whaling, too, offered fortunes in the form of oil for lamps and machinery. These industries were already pushing ships further south, where the waters grew colder and the icebergs more common. But beyond the commercial gains lay something harder to quantify: the prestige of discovery. Nations measured their standing against one another, not just in battles won or colonies held, but in the lines drawn on a chart. To plant a flag on a patch of coast that no rival could claim was as much a victory as winning a war, and far cheaper. For men like James Weddell, Fabian von Bellingshausen, or Jules Dumont d'Urville, sailing into Antarctic waters was as much about national honor as it was about personal ambition. Each degree of latitude gained was a point scored in an unspoken competition. And yet those motives were never simple. The scientists who joined these voyages often worked in the shadow of the national agenda, but their own goals were different. They brought with them delicate instruments, barometers, sextants, specimen jars, and a determination to record the minute details of a place that might never be visited again in their lifetime. For them, Antarctica was a library waiting to be catalogued. Every rock a clue, every bird a question, every glacier a record of the Earth's deeper history. Some were fascinated by the possibility of land beneath the ice, debating whether Antarctica was a single continent or a scattering of islands. Others were drawn to its living things, the penguins that walked like people in miniature, the whales that surfaced in slow arcs of muscle and breath, the seals that rested on ice floes as though they owned the sea itself. These were details no rival could erase with a flag. They belonged to anyone willing to endure the cold to record them. Of course, the lure of discovery had its darker side. Many who sailed south underestimated the distance, the cold, and the sheer scale of the ice. The stories of earlier failures were there for anyone to read. Crews trapped in frozen bays, ships crushed until they sank without trace, men lost to scurvy, frostbite, or the slow madness of isolation. Yet the risks seemed to make the challenge more intoxicating. To return with a chart no one else had, or to be the first to see a stretch of coastline, was to have achieved something that could not be bought or inherited. There is also the matter of timing. In the early 1800s, the world's great powers sensed that the age of discovery was nearing its end. Africa's coasts were mapped, the Americas were charted, the Pacific Islands plotted one by one. The North Pole still eluded explorers, but the South was the bigger prize. A landmass larger than Europe, untouched and largely unseen. In that context, Antarctica was not just another frontier, it was the last frontier. To ignore it was to leave the final chapter of the world's atlas unwritten.
For the men who answered the call, the journey began not with ice, but with anticipation. In ports from Hobart to Cape Town, ships took on barrels of salted meat, crates of hardtack, coils of rope, and casks of fresh water. Crews were assembled, some seasoned sailors, others green hands who had never seen snow. Officers paced the decks in the warm latitudes, rehearsing drills and checking the sails, knowing that soon they would be tested in ways for which no training could prepare them.
And then came the turn south. The moment when the warm winds faded, the days grew shorter, and the sea changed color to a darker, colder hue. It was a transition that could be felt as much as seen. The gulls disappeared, replaced by albatrosses gliding over the swells. The air took on a sharper edge, and somewhere ahead, beyond the mist, lay a place that had been calling to them for years. In the quiet hours before dawn, with the ship creaking gently and the lanterns swaying, a man might stand at the rail and ask himself why he had come. For fortune, for science, for the honor of his country? The truth was often a mixture of all three, tangled together with something harder to name, the restless pull to what was not yet known. It was this combination of tangible rewards and intangible dreams that drew them onward, mile after icy mile, into a place that would test not only their seamanship, but the very limits of their endurance. The lure of discovery was not just about what could be found, but about the act of finding, about stepping into a blank place on the map and leaving a mark that, however small, would outlast the cold and the wind. Imagine yourself in a dim wood-paneled library sometime in the late 18th century. The rain is steady against the windows, the air thick with the smell of old paper and ink. You run your fingers along rows of heavy books, atlases, natural histories, sailors' journals, and each one speaks of a place far to the south that almost no one has seen. The pages show a landmass so large it nearly touches every southern shore, an unbroken ring of earth waiting just beyond the edge of the known world. The maps are wrong, but in their errors lies the seed of the age's great Antarctic dream.
For centuries, European cartographers and philosophers had insisted that a great southern continent must exist to balance the land in the north. The symmetry was appealing, almost poetic. If there was Asia, Europe, and North America above the equator, there had to be an equivalent landmass below it. This concept, terra australis incognita, appeared on maps long before anyone could prove it was real. It was a vision, not shaped by observation, but by geometry and desire. The world, they believed, would look wrong without it. These imagined continents were not small. Some maps gave them mountain ranges taller than the Alps, rivers wider than the Nile, and climates gentle enough for agriculture. There were fanciful reports of fertile valleys, strange beasts, and even cities, none of them based on fact, all of them repeating from one source to the next, until they became common knowledge. In truth, no European ship had come close enough to see what lay beyond the roaring 40s, the howling 50s, and the screaming 60s, those wind-lashed latitudes that guarded the polar seas like a living wall. The early explorers who sailed south often carried these misconceptions with them. When James Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle in 1773, he expected to find at least some stretch of habitable coast, maybe even a warm inland sea, sheltered from the cold by mountain ridges. What he found instead was a solid, hostile barrier of pack ice, stretching so far in every direction that he doubted any man would ever cross it. Cook returned convinced that no fertile southern continent existed, and yet his very failure only deepened the mystery. If there was land beyond that ice, what kind of place could it be? And why was it so determined to keep visitors out? The myths also had a political purpose. Nations saw the imagined South as a potential source of wealth. Gold, spices, new trade routes. These fantasies justified the expense and risk of sending ships into dangerous waters. After all, it was easier to convince a government or a wealthy sponsor to fund a voyage if they believed they might return with tangible riches, rather than vague scientific observations. The truth that any land found would be locked in ice and barren of obvious treasures was not the kind of detail that made it into the official proposals.
Even the scientific community was influenced by these early misconceptions. Naturalists speculated about what plants might grow there, what animals might thrive. Some imagined lush forests adapted to cold. Others thought of massive herds of unknown grazers. The absence of hard evidence left the imagination free to wander, and wander it did. Illustrations in popular books showed towering cliffs of ice framing gentle harbors where ships could anchor in calm seas, a vision so far from reality that the first real photographs of Antarctica, taken in the early 20th century, shocked the public with their starkness. For sailors, the southern myths were both a lure and a warning. Old sea stories told of ships lost in sudden storms, of ghostly islands glimpsed through fog, or icebergs larger than cities that moved with deceptive slowness. Some spoke of ice blink, a strange glow on the horizon that hinted at pack ice long before it was visible, and treated it as a sign to turn back. Others saw it as proof that land was near, spurring them forward into danger. By the early 19th century, as sealing and whaling ships pushed further south, reality began to replace myth, but slowly. Reports came in of endless ice, of penguins and seals in great numbers, of bitter winds that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. And yet, even then, the misconceptions didn't fully vanish. Many believed that somewhere inland, away from the coastal ice, there might still be a habitable plateau, perhaps warmed by volcanic heat. The concept of an Antarctic oasis persisted long after evidence suggested otherwise.
It is easy to think of these early explorers as naive, but their misconceptions were, in a sense, inevitable. Without satellites, without aerial photography, without even the means to penetrate deep into the ice, they had little choice but to build their expectations from rumor, theory, and hope. The maps that resulted were a patchwork of truth and invention. The jagged lines of known coasts stitched to the smooth curves of imagined ones. In the end, these early myths served a purpose. They gave explorers a reason to go south, even if that reason was wrong. They filled the empty spaces in the mind long before they could be filled on the map. And perhaps most importantly, they created a sense of narrative, a belief that something waited at the bottom of the world, something worth the risk, the cold, and the long months of darkness. When the real Antarctica began to emerge from behind its wall of ice, it was harsher and more alien than the myths had ever suggested. But it was also more compelling. The truth, stripped of fantasy, was a challenge. No fertile valleys, no temperate harbors, no easy riches, only ice, wind, and the promise that those who braved them might earn a place in history.
Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a ship in a bustling 19th century port. The air smells of tar and salt. Ropes creak under strain, and gulls circle overhead, calling in the wind. Around you, sailors haul crates, carpenters hammer at repairs, and merchants bark prices to buyers. But your eyes aren't on the busy docks. They're on the horizon, toward a world no one you know has ever seen. South, always south.
By now, the idea of Antarctica has shifted from pure myth to a stubborn reality. Reports from whalers and sealers speak of vast colonies of animals, of seas teeming with life, and of coastlines hidden behind cliffs of ice. The great unknown still stretches inland, but the edges, the frozen fringes, are real enough to inspire men to risk their lives. And the reasons for that risk are not just curiosity. National pride was perhaps the strongest pull. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, empires were still carving their names onto the map, and to plant a flag on untouched land was a matter of prestige. The so-called heroic age of exploration was as much about geopolitics as it was about discovery. A nation could prove its power not only through colonies and armies, but by demonstrating that its explorers could conquer the most inhospitable places on Earth. Scientific discovery was another lure. The polar regions were seen as natural laboratories, places to study magnetism, weather, geology, and biology in ways impossible elsewhere. Expeditions promised to gather data that could improve navigation, predict storms, and even advance understanding of the planet's climate. For the scientists aboard, the frozen South was not just a frontier, it was a key to unlocking how the world itself worked. Then there was the lure of resources. The oceans around Antarctica were rich in whales, whose oil lit lamps and lubricated machines, in seals, whose pelts fetched high prices, and in fish that could be salted and sold in markets thousands of miles away. While the continent itself was too hostile to yield crops or timber, the surrounding waters promised fortunes, if you could survive them. Many expeditions were, in truth, commercial ventures,
thinly disguised as science. Ships sailed south in search of animals to hunt, and while they sometimes made discoveries, their real purpose was profit. Personal ambition played its part too. For many captains and adventurers, the pull of the South was deeply personal, a chance to be first, to be remembered. The names of explorers who reached new frontiers often lived on in history books, on maps, even in the names of the places they claimed. The risk of frostbite, starvation, and death was weighed against the possibility of immortality through fame. In an age before air travel, when the world still felt vast and uncharted, that was a powerful temptation. For some, though, the lure was less tangible, a calling they could not explain. The South was dangerous, yes, but it was also pure. A place where human presence was fleeting and nature reigned without compromise. To set foot on such land was to step outside the clutter of civilization, into a silence so complete it could feel sacred. Writers and poets described the polar regions as realms of sublime beauty, where icebergs shone like cathedrals, and the light itself took on colors unseen in warmer latitudes. The motivations often overlapped. A single expedition might have been driven by a nation's desire for prestige, funded by merchants hoping for profit, staffed by scientists chasing knowledge, and crewed by men simply hungry for adventure. In the cold, these differences blurred. Once the pack ice closed in and the wind began to scream across the deck, all motives reduced to one: survival. Still, before the hardships set in, the idea of the South burned bright. The planning stages were filled with optimism, maps studied, provisions gathered, letters of intent signed by sponsors. Lectures were given in city halls and scientific societies, painting the upcoming journey as a noble quest. In the public's mind, the explorers would stride heroically onto new land, plant their flag, and return with tales of triumph. Reality was harsher. The ice did not care about politics or glory. The sea did not yield its whales or seals without danger. The new land was not a welcoming frontier, but a frozen desert where mistakes were punished without mercy. Yet, even as word of failed voyages and lost ships filtered back to the ports, the lure did not fade. If anything, it grew, for each tragedy only deepened the sense that this was a place worthy of the ultimate test. And perhaps that was the most dangerous lure of all. The belief
that to face Antarctica was to measure oneself against the limits of endurance. The ice was not just an obstacle, it was an opponent. To challenge it was to prove to oneself and to the world that you belonged among the few who dared.
In the end, the South was never just a point on a map. It was a mirror in which nations, scientists, merchants, and adventurers saw the image they most wanted to believe about themselves, whether that image was of power, intellect, wealth, or courage. And so ship after ship turned their bows into the wind, chasing that reflection into the coldest waters on earth. Imagine yourself standing on a snow-packed plain, the horizon a perfect circle of white under a pale, low sun. There is no sound except for the wind's slow hiss across the ice. In the distance, two very different camps are preparing for the same goal, to be the first humans to stand at the South Pole. You can almost see them if you turn your head. To one side, a British team under Robert Falcon Scott. To the other, a Norwegian crew led by Roald Amundsen.
From a distance, the challenge looks the same. But step closer, and the differences are stark. Scott's camp feels like a piece of Edwardian England transplanted onto the ice. Military discipline, proper uniforms, neat rows of tents. His men have ponies and motor sledges, and their supplies are carefully packed in wooden crates. Everything is catalogued and planned, but much of it is untested in the brutal Antarctic conditions. Amundsen's camp, by contrast, feels stripped to the essentials. His men move quickly, their gear lean and functional. They have dogs, dozens of them, and their tents are low and aerodynamic, designed to shed the wind. Every piece of equipment has been tested in the Arctic, every decision shaped by years of polar experience. Where Scott's approach carries the weight of tradition, Amundsen's is guided by adaptation. Scott believed in the honor of the challenge. For him, the South Pole was not just a destination, but a stage for heroism. His expedition was as much about British pride and gentlemanly endurance as it was about speed. He dressed for the cold in wool and leather, relying on the toughness of his men to withstand the elements. His team would man-haul their sledges, walking, not riding, because that was the noble way to earn the prize. In Scott's view, suffering was part of the accomplishment. Amundsen saw the matter differently. He wanted to win, and he had no interest in suffering for its own sake.
His men wore fur clothing modelled after the Inuit, which trapped heat far more effectively than wool. They rode their sledges behind teams of dogs, covering more ground each day while conserving their strength. Where Scott saw honour in man-hauling, Amundsen saw wasted energy.
The two philosophies were reflected in their planning. Scott's route to the pole was longer, and he depended on depot caches of supplies laid far apart. His reliance on ponies and experimental motor sledges meant that when those failed, and they did, his men had to carry the burden themselves. Amundsen, on the other hand, chose a shorter route and placed his supply depots closer together. His dogs could carry heavy loads and still be fed from what they hauled, and in the harshest conditions, some dogs were sacrificed to feed the others and the men. In Britain, Amundsen's methods were sometimes criticized as ruthless, but in Antarctica, efficiency was the difference between life and death. Scott's expedition battled the weather and exhaustion from the start. His ponies struggled in deep snow, and the motor sledges broke down early. As temperatures dropped and the wind intensified, progress slowed to a crawl.
Amundsen's team, meanwhile, moved with precision. They left their base camp weeks before Scott and reached the pole more than a month ahead of him, planting the Norwegian flag in the ice on December 14th, 1911. For them, it was the culmination of meticulous planning, teamwork, and the willingness to adapt tradition to reality. When Scott's party finally reached the pole on January 17th, 1912, they found Amundsen's flag already there, along with a note confirming the Norwegian victory. The disappointment was crushing, but the worst was still to come. The return journey for Scott's team became a grim march toward exhaustion. With no dogs to pull their sledges, they struggled under the weight. Frostbite gnawed at their hands and feet. Supplies dwindled faster than expected, and blizzards pinned them down for days at a time. One by one, his men succumbed. First, Edward Wilson and Henry Bowers, then Lawrence Oates, who famously walked into the storm rather than slow the others down. Scott himself died with his remaining companions, trapped in their tent just 11 miles from a supply depot. Amundsen's team returned home without loss of life, their achievement celebrated in Norway as a triumph of skill and preparation. Scott's death, though a tragedy, cemented him as a national hero in Britain,
the image of stoic endurance in the face of impossible odds. The clash between their approaches became a lesson written in ice, that success in extreme environments depends not only on courage, but on choosing the right tools, the right strategies, and the right mindset for survival.
Even today, historians debate whether Scott's fate was inevitable or avoidable. Some argue that his devotion to traditional British values blinded him to more practical solutions. Others say that he was simply unlucky, caught in a rare convergence of brutal weather and bad fortune. What is clear is that both men embodied different visions of exploration, one rooted in the romance of the struggle, the other in the pragmatism of winning. And perhaps that is why their story endures. It's not just a tale of who reached the pole first, but a reminder that philosophy, the way you think about the challenge, can be as decisive as the challenge itself. In the Antarctic, where the smallest mistake can be fatal, the ice has no patience for sentiment. It rewards those who adapt.
Imagine yourself on the deck of a ship locked fast in a prism of ice. The world around you is an endless sheet of white and blue, stretching to the horizon in every direction. The wind bites at your face with the sting of frozen needles, and beneath your boots the wooden planks creak under the strain of a vessel trapped in place. This is the Endurance, and its name will prove to be less of a title and more of a prophecy. It is 1914, and Sir Ernest Shackleton's Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition has set out with an almost impossible ambition: to make the first land crossing of Antarctica from coast to coast via the South Pole. The plan was daring, even by the standards of the heroic age of exploration, a feat of endurance across more than 1,800 miles of the harshest terrain on Earth. Shackleton was no stranger to Antarctic hardship, but what lay ahead would test the limits of human resilience in ways no one on board could have imagined. The Endurance never even reached the Antarctic coast. As the ship pushed deeper into the Weddell Sea, the pack ice began to close in. At first, it was a slow tightening, a gentle squeeze that could be navigated with patience. But by January 1915, the ice had trapped them completely, locking the ship in place. The frozen sea was not still. It shifted and buckled under pressure, groaning like a living thing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still the ice held them captive. Shackleton understood that the expedition's grand goal was gone.
Now the mission was simple: survival. He ordered the crew to treat their imprisonment as a temporary setback, keeping morale high with routine tasks, games, and even theatrical performances. He knew that despair could be as deadly as the cold, and he worked tirelessly to keep his men focused and hopeful. But the ice had other plans. In October 1915, the shifting floes began to crush the Endurance. The sound of timbers snapping under the pressure was like gunfire in the stillness. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The crew salvaged what they could: tents, sledges, food, and lifeboats, before the Endurance slipped beneath the ice. They were now stranded on the floes, hundreds of miles from the nearest human settlement, with no means of communication and no guarantee of rescue. Life on the ice was a battle against monotony and misery. The men lived in makeshift camps, their tents battered by wind and snow. They hunted seals and penguins to supplement their dwindling food stores, melting ice for drinking water. Shackleton kept a strict routine, knowing that structure was essential for morale. He shared the hardships of his men, eating the same food, sleeping in the same freezing tents, and taking his turn at the most unpleasant tasks. When the ice began to break up in April 1916, Shackleton knew they had to move. The men loaded into the 3 lifeboats and began a desperate journey across the freezing, turbulent waters of the Southern Ocean. After days of misery, they reached the desolate, uninhabited Elephant Island, the first solid ground they had touched in more than a year. But it was no place to wait for help. The island lay far from any shipping routes, and the chance of rescue was almost non-existent. Faced with this reality, Shackleton made a decision that would define his legacy. He chose 5 men, including his trusted navigator, Frank Worsley, and prepared one of the lifeboats, the James Caird, for an 800-mile voyage to the whaling stations of South Georgia Island. It was a journey through some of the roughest seas on Earth, in a vessel barely fit for open water. The voyage was a nightmare of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Waves rose like moving walls, drenching them in freezing spray. Ice formed on the boat's rigging, weighing it down. Navigation was almost impossible in the stormy skies, but Worsley's skill kept them on course. After more than 2 weeks, battered and near collapse, they sighted the cliffs of South Georgia. Their ordeal was not over. The whaling station lay on the far side of the island, separated by a range of jagged, snow-covered mountains no one had ever crossed. Shackleton, Worsley, and Tom Crean set out on foot, traversing glaciers and ridges without proper climbing gear, guided only by instinct and determination. After 36 continuous hours of marching, they descended into the whaling station at Stromness, startling the workers who could scarcely believe the figures before them were human. Shackleton immediately organized a rescue for the men left behind. It took multiple attempts, blocked by ice and storms, but on August 30th, 1916, more than 2 years after leaving for Antarctica, Shackleton returned to Elephant Island. Every single man of the Endurance crew was alive. The crossing of Antarctica had failed, but Shackleton's leadership turned what could have been a mass tragedy into one of the greatest survival stories in history. His ability to adapt, to prioritize the lives of his men over the glory of the mission, and to inspire them to endure against impossible odds remains a benchmark for leadership in extreme conditions. In the frozen wastelands of the South, where nature is both magnificent and merciless, Shackleton's name became synonymous with resilience. The ice took his ship, his mission, and nearly his hope, but it never took his men. Imagine yourself standing on the edge of a vast, untouched white plain, where the horizon seems to dissolve into the sky. There are no flags planted here, no cheering crowds waiting at the finish line. You are hundreds of miles from the nearest human, and the only sounds are the whisper of wind over snow and the faint creak of the ice beneath your boots. The world remembers Shackleton, Amundsen, and Scott, but there were others. Men who endured the same brutal cold, faced the same unforgiving storms, and yet never saw their names etched in the public memory. This is their domain. In the early 20th century, the lure of Antarctica was not just for the famous. Expeditions large and small set sail, many with modest aims, to map an uncharted coastline, to study penguin colonies, or to record weather data in a land where even the air itself seemed hostile. These smaller missions often lacked the resources of the great national expeditions, but their crews were no less determined.
Take the Australasian Antarctic expedition of 1911 to 1914, led by Douglas Mawson. While Mawson's name is known to some, the men who stood beside him remain obscure. Xavier Mertz, a Swiss mountaineer, was one of them. He was not only an expert skier, but also the kind of man who faced hardship without complaint. When disaster struck, a sledge fell into a crevasse, taking most of the food and a fellow explorer with it. Mertz pushed on through sheer will. He and Mawson tried to survive by eating their sledge dogs, but the meat proved toxic. Mertz fell gravely ill and died on the ice far from home. His sacrifice allowed Mawson to push on alone and return with valuable scientific data. Without Mertz, the expedition's story might have ended much sooner.
Then there was the Belgian Antarctic expedition of 1897 to 1899, led by Adrien de Gerlache. This was the first expedition to overwinter in Antarctica, not by choice, but because their ship, the Belgica, became trapped in the pack ice. While de Gerlache's leadership and Frederick Cook's medical ingenuity are sometimes noted, the quiet heroics of the crew often go unmentioned. Sailors like Roald Amundsen, then a young unknown officer, learned here the survival techniques that would one day help him beat Scott to the South Pole. Another unsung figure was Norwegian sailor Carl Wenck, who braved treacherous seas to keep the ship supplied during the early stages, only to be washed overboard and lost before the ice claimed them. Consider also the Norwegia expeditions of the late 1920s, backed by Norwegian whaling interests. These were not headline-grabbing races to the pole, but methodical surveys of the Antarctic coastline. Men like Hjalmar Reiser Larsen piloted fragile aircraft over the ice, mapping vast stretches of uncharted land. The flights were dangerous. Primitive navigation, unpredictable weather, and engines that could seize in the cold. Yet they expanded the world's knowledge of Antarctica in ways that later expeditions would rely upon. Not all the unsung heroes were leaders or officers. Many were stokers, cooks, and deckhands, men whose work was essential but whose names never appeared in newspapers. In the harsh conditions of the ice, a cook's ability to stretch dwindling rations into something warm and edible could mean the difference between morale and mutiny. A stoker who kept the ship's engine running in sub-zero conditions ensured that the vessel remained a lifeline rather than a drifting coffin. Their heroism was quiet, unglamorous, but absolutely necessary. Even scientists on these expeditions often faded into obscurity despite groundbreaking work. Biologists collected samples in freezing winds. Geologists chipped away at rock faces with numb fingers. And meteorologists recorded hourly observations through the endless polar night. Their findings, often published in technical journals read only by specialists, laid the groundwork for modern climate science and our understanding of polar ecosystems. And then there are the forgotten rescue attempts. In 1912, when the Japanese Antarctic expedition, led by Nobu Shirase, failed to reach the South Pole, they redirected their efforts to exploring King Edward VII Land. Their mission lacked the drama of a race or the tragedy of a disaster, yet they demonstrated a rare adaptability in the face of failure. They returned home with valuable observations and without losing a single man, a quiet triumph overshadowed by the headlines of Scott's doomed return. What binds these stories together is the absence of an audience. These men did not endure frostbite, hunger, and isolation for fame. In many cases, they returned to ordinary lives, their tales told only in logbooks, family stories, or dusty archives. Some died in obscurity, their graves far from the icy landscapes they once traversed. Yet their legacy is embedded in every map, every chart, and every line of data that defines our understanding of Antarctica today. They were the ones who filled in the blanks between the great expeditions, who proved that exploration was not always about planting a flag, but about persistence, precision, and quiet courage. When we think of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, it's easy to picture the grand gestures, the planting of flags, the dramatic photographs, the stirring speeches. But the ice remembers differently. It remembers the footsteps of men who trudged through blizzards without hope of recognition, who repaired sledges with frost-bitten hands, who kept the fire going when the wind seemed determined to snuff it out. The frozen continent is not just a monument to the famous. It is a memorial to them all, the celebrated and the forgotten alike. Imagine yourself in a place where the horizon offers no change, no relief, no end. For months, the sun has vanished,
replaced by an endless black sky filled with stars so sharp and close they almost seem to cut. The air is dry and cold enough to sting your lungs with every breath, but it is not the frost that wears you down. It is the silence, a silence so complete that even your own voice sounds foreign, like it belongs to someone else. In the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, physical dangers were obvious: frostbite, hunger, storms. But the slow erosion of the mind was just as deadly. Isolation was total. Letters to home took months, and the only human contact was with the same handful of men you saw every day. In a tent, in a hut, on a ship trapped in ice, there was no escape from each other, and no escape from yourself. During the long polar night, weeks could pass without seeing the sun. Darkness became a constant presence, and in that darkness time lost meaning. Days blurred into nights, hours into minutes, and the sense of progression that the world was moving forward simply stopped. Some men adapted, structuring their days with strict routines, keeping journals, setting small goals. Others withdrew, speaking less and less, until even the most basic tasks felt like an impossible effort. Monotony was a cruel companion. Meals repeated endlessly, salted meat, hard biscuits, tea. The landscape never changed. The same stretch of snow, the same crunch underfoot, the same sound of wind. It wasn't just boredom, it was sensory deprivation. The human brain craves variety, and in Antarctica, variety was almost non-existent. Conflicts could flare from the smallest sparks. A careless word, a misplaced tool, an uneven share of rations, all could trigger days of tension in a confined space. In the cramped quarters of a winter hut, the smell of unwashed clothes, damp fur, and stale food clung to everything, mingling with the sour scent of fatigue and frustration. Men who had been friends at the start of a voyage sometimes ended it unable to speak to each other. The constant awareness of danger magnified the strain. A wrong step could mean falling into a hidden crevasse. A storm could trap you in your tent for days, with nothing to do but listen to the wind batter the fabric and wonder if it would tear. The knowledge that no one could rescue you if things went wrong was always there, silent but heavy. Sleep often brought no rest. Some men suffered from vivid, unsettling dreams, hallucinations born of cold, hunger, or exhaustion. Others lay awake for hours, listening to the groans of ice shifting beneath the ship, or the distant crack of a glacier breaking apart. The mind, deprived of stimulation, began to create its own, sometimes in the form of inspiration, but just as often in the form of paranoia.
A few explorers documented what we might now call polar madness. It began subtly. A man might start talking to himself, or staring for long periods at nothing. Over time, he might become convinced that someone in the camp meant him harm, or that he could hear voices in the wind. In the most severe cases, judgment broke down completely, and dangerous mistakes followed.
Leaders understood, at least intuitively, that mental resilience was as important as physical strength. Ernest Shackleton, for example, was meticulous about keeping morale high during the Endurance expedition. He organized games, storytelling sessions, and even small celebrations, no matter how bleak the situation. He knew that idle minds turned inward too easily, and in the Antarctic that could be fatal. Still, not every expedition had such foresight. On less well-led missions, the darkness and isolation ate away at men until they became unrecognizable to themselves. They returned home alive, but changed, restless, withdrawn, or unable to rejoin the rhythm of ordinary life. Some never spoke of their experiences at all, as if locking the memories away was the only way to move forward.
The psychological toll of Antarctic exploration is harder to measure than frostbite scars or lost fingers, but it was every bit as real. The men who endured it carried invisible weight for the rest of their lives, and while their names might not appear alongside the great feats of endurance, their survival in the face of that mental strain was a triumph in its own right. Imagine yourself stepping out of a small canvas-walled hut into air so cold it burns the inside of your nose before you've taken a second breath. The snow beneath your boots is not soft, but hard-packed and sharp, squeaking under each step in a way that reminds you of its dry, frozen nature. The horizon is a white line meeting a grey sky, and in every direction there is nothing but emptiness. You are in the heart of the most inhospitable environment on Earth, a place where even the simplest act becomes an ordeal. For early Antarctic explorers, the challenges began long before they set foot on the ice. The voyage south was itself a trial,
months aboard a cramped wooden ship, navigating treacherous southern oceans where waves could rise higher than masts. The cold crept into every corner of the vessel, freezing ropes solid, locking sails with ice, and frosting the bedding so that waking in the morning meant breaking through a layer of frozen breath.
Once ashore, the real battle began. Every expedition carried the weight of logistics. Food, fuel, shelter, and equipment had to be hauled across the ice, often by man-hauling. Teams of men strapped into harnesses, dragging sledges that could weigh hundreds of kilograms. There were dogs on some expeditions, ponies on others, but animals could not always survive the conditions, leaving human muscle as the only reliable force. Each mile was earned in sweat and pain. The weather itself was not merely an inconvenience, but an active, relentless enemy. Temperatures could plunge below -40 degrees Celsius, with winds strong enough to knock a man to his knees. Frostbite was an ever-present threat, claiming fingers, toes, and, in the worst cases, entire limbs. Even properly dressed, the cold found its way in, through seams, through gaps, through the slow seep of body heat into the vast frozen expanse. Storms, or blizzards in polar terms, could last for days, reducing visibility to nothing more than the space inside your hood. To move in such conditions was to risk walking in circles, stumbling into crevasses, or simply disappearing into the white. Many explorers learned to pitch tents quickly and wait, surviving on rationed food and the hope that the storm would eventually pass. The ice itself was a labyrinth of hazards. Crevices, deep cracks hidden beneath thin layers of snow, could swallow a man or sledge without warning. Crossing glaciers meant listening for the ominous groan of shifting ice, knowing that somewhere beneath lay a cold blue void. Sea ice posed its own dangers, cracking and breaking without warning under the pressure of tides and wind. Supplies were another constant worry. Food was heavy and spoiled quickly without proper care, and fuel, usually in the form of coal or paraffin, was limited. Without fuel, there was no way to melt snow for drinking water, no way to cook, and no way to keep frost from settling inside sleeping quarters. Some expeditions learned this the hard way, watching rations dwindle and resorting to eating sled dogs, seal meat, or whatever could be found on the ice. Medical challenges compounded the struggle. Scurvy,
caused by a lack of fresh fruit and vegetables was a lingering spectre until its prevention was fully understood. Frostbite could turn minor injuries into crippling disabilities. A simple infection, far from any doctor, could become fatal. And yet men pressed on, often hiding their pain to avoid being sent back or slowing the team.
Even navigation was a battle. In an environment without landmarks, compasses were unreliable near the pole, and maps were speculative at best. Whiteouts erased the horizon entirely, leaving explorers disoriented in a blank void. To travel was to rely on skill, instinct, and sometimes sheer luck.
Every day brought the same unyielding demands. Move forward, carry the load, endure the cold, conserve the food, watch for danger. And behind all of it was the knowledge that failure meant not just personal loss, but the collapse of the expedition and possibly the death of everyone involved.
What makes these challenges truly unfathomable to modern eyes is not just the scale of the hardship, but the absence of any safety net. Today's explorers carry radios, GPS, insulated gear, and satellite communication. The early Antarctic pioneers had wool, canvas, guesswork, and each other. When disaster struck, no one was coming. Yet, in facing these challenges, they revealed the depth of human endurance, the ability to push forward into a place that offered nothing but resistance, simply because turning back meant surrendering the dream of discovery. In Antarctica, the land itself was the adversary, and to survive even a single season was a victory measured not in miles, but in the sheer act of persistence. Imagine yourself standing in a wind-lashed camp on the Antarctic ice, watching as two men crouch over a sledge, their faces wrapped in frost-rimmed scarves. One holds a knife, the other a strip of leather, and between them they are reworking the harness straps, not because they enjoy tinkering, but because the life of the team depends on it. Out here, innovation is not about invention for glory, it is about survival.
Early Antarctic exploration was a proving ground for human ingenuity. Every obstacle demanded a solution, and often those solutions had to be conceived with limited materials, no manuals, and no second chances. The conditions on the ice were not just harsh, they actively destroyed equipment. Metal became brittle, Leather straps froze and cracked. Wooden sledges warped in the moistureless cold. The explorers could not wait for replacements. They had to adapt on the spot.
Sledge design, for example, was a constant topic of experimentation. Some expeditions swore by the traditional Norwegian style, long, narrow runners and lightweight frames that could skim over snow. Others tried heavier, sturdier models to survive the crushing stress of ice ridges and rough ground. Shackleton's men famously reinforced their sledges with metal plates scavenged from packing crates, while others added canvas sides to keep snow out of the cargo.
Clothing, too, underwent transformation born of necessity. The earliest explorers wore wool and thick furs, layering as best they could. But sweating in these layers could be as dangerous as the cold itself. Damp fabric froze quickly, leaching away body heat. Over time, they learned to dress in looser layers, trapping air for insulation and venting when exertion built up too much heat. Amundsen, borrowing from Inuit knowledge, adopted fur garments tailored for flexibility, while Scott's team experimented with windproof outer shells made of tightly woven cotton. For transport, the use of animals was another field of innovation. Ponies were tried but fared poorly in the cold and on unstable ice. Dogs, on the other hand, thrived if managed well, but required careful rationing of food and constant attention to health. Harness styles were adjusted, feeding schedules optimized, and resting intervals planned with military precision. Even so, many teams eventually relied on man-hauling, leading to experiments with harness geometry to distribute weights more evenly and reduce exhaustion. Cooking and heating posed unique challenges. Paraffin stoves were standard, but their efficiency dropped drastically in extreme cold. Explorers modified burner nozzles, insulated fuel containers, and even built snow shelters around cooking areas to shield the flame from wind. On the Endurance expedition, Shackleton's crew learned to use blubber from seals and penguins as a fuel source when supplies ran low. An unpleasant but effective solution. Navigation also demanded creative thinking. With compasses unreliable near the magnetic pole and few recognizable landmarks, teams developed hybrid methods, combining celestial navigation with dead reckoning, using wind direction, snowdrift patterns, and the sun's arc to maintain course. Some expeditions carried sextants, modified for gloved hands, and logs were kept meticulously, knowing that a single navigational error could doom the entire mission. One of the most ingenious adaptations
was in the realm of shelter. Standard tents were often too low to allow men to sit up comfortably, trapping heat but cramping movement. Crews learned to dig snow trenches to pitch tents within, lowering the profile against the wind and creating a natural windbreak. Others experimented with double-layered tent walls or insulated ground cloths to slow the loss of heat into the snow. When tents were damaged beyond repair, some men built igloo-like structures from snow blocks, an approach borrowed directly from indigenous Arctic practices.
Scientific work, the driving force behind many expeditions, also required adaptation. Instruments froze, glass cracked, ink solidified. Thermometers had to be kept close to the body to prevent freezing, and cameras were insulated with layers of cloth to keep the shutters moving. Geological samples were stored in whatever containers could be repurposed, from food tins to fabric pouches, ensuring they survived the long return journey.
Perhaps the greatest innovation was psychological, the ability to turn scarcity into opportunity. When food was short, recipes evolved. Hardtack softened in seal broth, pemmican mixed with crushed biscuits to stretch rations, tea leaves reused multiple times. Entertainment, too, was improvised. Makeshift chess sets from carved wood, card games scrolled on scrap paper, even theatre nights where men acted out plays in whatever costumes could be assembled. These acts were not frivolous. They kept morale alive in a place where despair could be as deadly as cold.
The ingenuity of these explorers was not the grand industrial sort that built cities and railways. It was a quiet, persistent creativity, the kind that takes place with numb fingers and limited light, under the constant pressure of knowing that every problem must be solved before it becomes fatal. In Antarctica, innovation was measured not in patents, but in lives saved, miles gained, and the simple fact of returning home at all.
Imagine yourself in a tent no larger than a small dining table, the fabric snapping violently in the wind. The light is a dim, pale glow seeping through frost-covered walls, and the air inside tastes faintly of paraffin smoke and damp wool. It has been weeks since you last saw open water, months since you felt the warmth of the sun, and the thought of green grass or the scent of a forest seems so distant it might as well be a memory from another life. Outside, lies an endless expanse of white. Beautiful, yes, but empty, silent, and inescapable.
The greatest challenge for early Antarctic explorers was not always the cold, the hunger, or the physical strain. It was the relentless assault on the mind. The continent offered no comforting horizon, no natural change of scenery. It was a world without shadows in summer, when the sun refused to set for months on end, and without light in winter, when the darkness swallowed everything for equally long stretches. This monotony gnawed at perception, distorting the passage of time and eroding the sense of self.
Isolation played its own cruel role. Many expeditions were reduced to tiny groups, sometimes only a handful of men, cut off from all human contact beyond their tent or hut. Letters from home could take years to arrive, if they arrived at all. The awareness of being so far removed from the rest of humanity created a peculiar kind of loneliness, not just the absence of company, but the crushing certainty that no one could reach you quickly if disaster struck.
In such conditions, the smallest irritations could fester. A snoring tent mate, a careless remark, the sound of someone chewing, all could become unbearable triggers when repeated day after day with no escape. Historical diaries reveal that minor disputes over food portions or sleeping arrangements could escalate into cold silences that lasted weeks. Commanders had to balance discipline with empathy, ensuring that resentment did not fracture the fragile unity on which survival depended. The cold itself was a mental enemy. It crept in slowly, numbing fingers, clouding thoughts, and sapping willpower. Even the act of preparing to leave the tent could feel monumental, forcing yourself into frozen boots, struggling into stiff layers of clothing, bracing against the wind that you knew would cut through every gap. Every small task demanded energy, and in that constant drain, the mind had to battle the temptation to give in, to stay still just a little too long.
Endless daylight posed its own strain. During the Antarctic summer, the perpetual sun made it difficult to rest, distorting sleep patterns and leaving men disoriented. In the opposite season, the long polar night carried its own psychological weight. Darkness magnified every sound, the groan of shifting ice, the distant crack of a glacier calving, turning the outside world into a vast unseen presence. Some men reported hearing voices or footsteps in the wind,
their minds straining for any sign of life in the empty expanse. Boredom was a constant adversary. Once daily routines were set, the hours stretched endlessly. Without purposeful activity, the mind began to wander into dangerous territory, dwelling on fears, regrets, or obsessions. Expeditions fought this mental erosion with strict schedules, shared meals at fixed times, chores rotated to keep men engaged, and planned diversions like reading aloud, singing, or staging amateur plays. These were not luxuries, they were essential tools for preserving mental stability. The threat of disaster hovered over everything. A single wrong step could send a man through thin ice. A sudden storm could strand a sledging party miles from shelter. Injuries were treated with whatever resources were at hand, often under appalling conditions. Knowing that every action carried risk meant that caution became second nature, but so too did a background hum of anxiety, a constant awareness that the line between life and death was perilously thin.
Even moments of apparent calm could be deceptive. Shackleton's crew on the Endurance, for example, endured months trapped in ice with no hope of forward movement. In their diaries, they described the maddening combination of inactivity and dread, the sense of being both stuck and hunted, as if the ice itself were a slow predator closing in. When the ship finally broke under the pressure, the mental shock was almost as severe as the physical danger.
There was also the crushing weight of responsibility. Expedition leaders had to project confidence, even when their own doubts threatened to overwhelm them. In such an environment, morale could hinge on a single decision, whether to press on or turn back, to conserve rations or risk a hunt, to keep moving in a storm or hunker down and wait. The wrong choice could cost lives, and the knowledge of that fact pressed heavily on every commander.
For many, returning home did not end the struggle. The psychological toll often lingered, an unease in crowded places, a craving for solitude, or recurring dreams of ice and silence. Some men found themselves longing to return to the very place that had nearly broken them, not out of nostalgia, but because normal life seemed trivial after surviving the raw edges of the world.
In the end, Antarctic exploration was as much a test of the mind as it was of the body.
The white horizon could be both a promise and a prison, and survival demanded not only physical resilience, but a mental strength that could endure the slow grind of days without end. Out here, courage was not just measured in bold acts, but in the quiet decision to rise each morning, face the same empty landscape, and take another step into the cold.
Imagine yourself waking to the sound of canvas straining in the wind, the cold pressing through every seam of your shelter. You pull on frozen boots, stiff as boards, and step outside into a white world where horizon and sky are indistinguishable. There's no grand speech, no rallying cry. Survival here depends on the smallest, quietest habits, passed from one frost-bitten hand to another. These were not rules written in any official manual, but they were the difference between coming home and becoming another name in a logbook of the lost.
One such rule was simple: never ignore a wet glove. The moment snow melted into the fibers turned to ice, and ice turned to injury. A careless hand, even for a few minutes, could mean days of agony or the loss of fingers. Men learned to shake out every trace of snow before it could seep in, even during storms, even when the urgency of the moment screamed for haste. Another unwritten code: always sleep with your boots inside the tent or under your sleeping bag. Leather left outside froze solid, and in the morning, hours could be wasted trying to make them wearable again. Those who broke this rule once rarely had the chance to break it twice.
There were food rules too. Never eat all your rations in one go, no matter how hungry you were. Out here, hunger was constant, but running out of food was death. Explorers learned to eat in measured bites, keeping energy steady rather than chasing the fleeting relief of fullness. Even a sliver of chocolate was saved for the worst days, a psychological anchor as much as a caloric reserve. And then there was the ritual of melting snow for water. Never eat it raw. The body spent precious heat melting it internally, draining the energy you needed to endure the day.
Another practice was what Shackleton's men called silent watch. At night, someone always listened, not for voices, but for the groan of shifting ice or the whisper of wind changing direction. A sudden sound could mean the ice beneath the camp was breaking, or that a blizzard was minutes away. Waking the team early could save lives. This constant vigilance was rarely acknowledged, but it became second nature to those who survived more than one season on the ice.
Even movement had rules. Never walk alone beyond sight of camp, no matter how near the destination seemed. Snow could hide crevasses deep enough to swallow a man whole, and one misstep could turn a short errand into an unmarked grave. Teams roped together not for efficiency, but as a silent pact. If one man fell, the others would pull him back. And when the weather closed in, there was one final, absolute law. Stop. Pitch camp, wait it out. Survive the day before trying for the next.
These rules lived only in memory, not in writing. They were passed in murmurs over stoves, shown in the way a veteran adjusted a newcomer's gear without a word. Embedded in routines so deeply they became instinct. Out here, survival wasn't just about heroics. It was about discipline in the smallest acts, day after day, until the ice finally let you go. Imagine yourself standing on a stretch of Antarctic ice so still that even the wind has fallen silent. Around you, the horizon curves into a perfect, unbroken white. Beneath your boots is not just snow, it's history. And in places, it's a grave. There are no markers here, no carved stones, no names etched for the living to visit. The dead in this place lie under meters of drifting snow, preserved by the cold, forgotten by most, remembered only by the few who know where to look. Every era of exploration carved its losses into this continent. Some were swift and brutal, a man stepping into a hidden crevasse, vanishing with a shout cut short. Others were drawn out over weeks, like Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his team in 1912, trapped by blizzards just 11 miles from a supply depot. They died one by one in their tent, frostbitten, starving, too weak to light the stove. When a search party found them months later, their journals told the story with the clarity of men who knew they would not see home again. Scott's last entry ended simply, "For God's sake, look after our people."
Shackleton's expeditions, often remembered for their survival, also skirted close to the edge of such graves. In 1908, on the Nimrod expedition, 3 of his men attempted to reach the South Pole, but turned back just 97 miles short, already frostbitten and starving. Had they pressed on, their camp today would be another buried relic. Others weren't so lucky. Adrien de Gelach's Belgian Antarctic expedition saw men lose their sanity in the endless winter night, some to scurvy, some to despair. Death here was not always from the cold. Sometimes it came from the mind surrendering before the body.
There were also those whose names barely made the footnotes. The crew members, scientists, and assistants whose deaths drew no headlines. A sledging party missing in a whiteout. A cook collapsing from exhaustion after weeks of half rations. A stoker swept into freezing seas when ice tore at a ship's hull. Their stories, if recorded at all, were buried in official reports that no one outside their circle ever read. The Antarctic did not care for fame or rank. It claimed men indiscriminately.
And the graves themselves, if you can call them that, were unlike anywhere else on Earth. In the early years, bodies were sometimes left in tents, zipped shut and abandoned as snow buried them. In other cases, the ice itself became a coffin, swallowing the dead into its slow-moving glaciers. Over decades, those glaciers might carry the remains miles toward the sea, where they would eventually carve into icebergs and drift into nothingness. Some explorers spoke of feeling watched when they passed old camps, as though the ice remembered who had lain down there and never risen again.
These deaths were not without meaning. Each one taught a hard lesson about planning, about caution, about the limits of human endurance. The maps improved, the gear evolved, the routes were chosen with greater care. But even now, modern expeditions sometimes come across relics of those who came before. A weathered boot, a rusted tin, a diary frozen shut. In Antarctica, the past does not rot, it waits. And for those who venture here, every step is a reminder that the line between exploration and a white grave is as thin as ice in the spring sun.
Imagine yourself in a cramped wooden hut on the edge of the Ross ice shelf, the wind outside howling like a living thing. Inside, the air smells faintly of kerosene and damp wool. Around you, men hunch over notebooks, their breath visible in the frigid air as they scratch down rows of numbers: wind speed, barometric pressure, sea ice thickness. Outside these thin walls lies a frozen wasteland. Inside, the beginnings of modern polar science are being written.
In the earliest days, Antarctic expeditions were judged by headlines: who reached the pole first, who survived the longest, who braved the harshest conditions. Scientific data, though often collected, was treated almost like an afterthought. Yet even during the heroic age, some understood that the true victory was not planting a flag, but planting knowledge that would outlast them. Edward Wilson, the chief scientist on Scott's doomed Terra Nova expedition, carried fossilized plants from the Beardmore Glacier all the way to his death in the tent, proof that Antarctica had once been green. That small sample would later support the theory of continental drift, changing how we understood Earth's history.
Over time, priorities shifted. By the 1920s and 30s, expeditions began to leave behind not just footprints and graves, but permanent research stations. The British Graham Land expedition, the Norwegian, British, Swedish Antarctic expedition, and others turned their focus to meteorology, glaciology, and mapping the coastline with precision. The work was slow, repetitive, and lacked the drama of racing to the pole, but it built a foundation of data that would prove far more valuable than any single act of conquest.
The equipment evolved as well. Where Scott's men had used mercury thermometers and sextants, later teams brought radios, theodolites, and early aerial photography. The measurements became systematic. The maps became more accurate. Weather records from those years still form part of the datasets used by climate scientists today. Each table of figures, each logbook entry, was a piece of a puzzle no one had yet seen completed.
And perhaps the most profound change was in the motivation itself. The explorers of the heroic age sought glory for nations. Their successors sought clarity for all humanity. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 would eventually formalize that shift, dedicating the continent to peaceful scientific cooperation. But its roots were here, in those long nights where a handful of men, shivering in makeshift shelters, decided that measuring the wind mattered as much as surviving it.
Today's researchers arrive with satellite links, insulated labs, and emergency airlifts, luxuries unthinkable to their predecessors. Yet when they lower ice cores from the heart of a glacier, or track the migration of emperor penguins, they continue a chain of work begun by men who froze ink into their pens and still forced it onto paper. The heroics have faded from the headlines, but the data, silent, precise, enduring, remains. And in the end, it is this record, not the race, that has shaped how we understand the most remote place on Earth.
Imagine yourself standing on a wind-carved ridge, the ice stretching in every direction like a frozen ocean, unbroken except by the faint shadow of distant mountains. There is no human sound here, only the low groan of moving ice beneath your boots, and the sharp hiss of snow as the wind drags it across the surface. It is a silence so complete that you feel it pressing against your ears. In a place like this, where the scale defies comprehension and the cold could kill within minutes, the idea that people once fought over ownership seems almost absurd. And yet they did. For much of the 20th century, Antarctica was not just a blank on the map. It was a potential prize, a territory to be claimed, divided, and exploited.
Before the Antarctic Treaty, there was no common agreement about who owned the continent. Several nations, Britain, Argentina, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, France, and Norway, laid overlapping claims, many of them based on early expeditions or the planting of flags on remote headlands. These were not idle gestures. They were backed by political speeches, maps colored to reflect possession, and occasionally the construction of small outposts meant to establish a physical presence. Even countries without a direct claim, like the United States and the Soviet Union, made it clear they reserved the right to assert one in the future. In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, the possibility that Antarctica could become yet another geopolitical flashpoint was very real. But something remarkable happened. Instead of escalating into a frozen land grab, the nations involved came together in 1959 to sign the Antarctic Treaty, a document that remains one of the most unusual agreements in modern diplomacy. The treaty declared that Antarctica would be used exclusively for peaceful purposes, prohibited any new claims or expansion of existing ones, and banned military activity on the continent. It also guaranteed freedom of scientific investigation, allowing researchers from any country to work anywhere in Antarctica, regardless of territorial lines. For a world deeply divided along ideological lines, this was nothing short of extraordinary.
The motivations for this cooperation were not purely idealistic. Science played a crucial role. During the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 58,
Teams from a dozen nations had worked side by side in Antarctica, sharing data on weather, ice movement, and the Earth's magnetic field. These collaborations proved that even in a politically fractured world, mutual benefit could outweigh competition. At the same time, the sheer hostility of the Antarctic environment discouraged the kind of extractive industries that might have otherwise spurred conflict. Oil, minerals, and other resources were known or suspected to exist beneath the ice, but the technology to exploit them in such extreme conditions was far from ready. In a sense, the continent's inaccessibility bought it time.
The Antarctic Treaty was not a one-time gesture. It became the foundation of what is now known as the Antarctic Treaty System, a framework that has grown to include more than 50 signatory countries. Over the decades, additional agreements have strengthened protections for the environment, safeguarded marine life, and prohibited activities like mining. One of the most significant of these is the Protocol on Environmental Protection, signed in 1991, which designates Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. Under this protocol, mining is banned indefinitely, and strict rules govern waste disposal, wildlife interactions, and the construction of research facilities.
Walking through a modern Antarctic research station, you can see the practical effects of these rules. Waste is carefully sorted and shipped out of the continent. Vehicles are limited in where they can travel to avoid disturbing delicate ecosystems. Even footprints can be a concern in certain areas where lichens or microbial mats take decades to recover from disturbance. These measures may seem extreme, but they reflect an understanding that Antarctica's value lies not in what can be taken from it, but in what can be preserved.
Yet the treaty is not without its tensions. Climate change is transforming Antarctica at a pace that scientists are still struggling to measure, and with melting ice comes the possibility of easier access to resources. Some countries have already begun positioning themselves for a future in which the treaty's mining ban might be reconsidered. The agreement can be reviewed after 2048, and while no one can predict what the geopolitical landscape will look like then, it is unlikely that the question of resource exploitation will remain dormant forever. The challenge will be whether the spirit of cooperation that created the treaty can survive in a world where scarcity and competition are growing.
In this way, Antarctica serves as both a triumph and a warning. It is one of the few places on Earth where nations have chosen restraint over conquest, science
over politics and preservation over exploitation. But it is also a reminder that such restraint is fragile, dependent on the continued goodwill and self-interest of its participants. The white silence that covers the continent today is not a permanent shield. It is a pause, a reprieve, one that could end if the balance shifts.
As you stand there on the ridge, looking out over the ice, it is tempting to believe that this vast emptiness will always be beyond the reach of human greed. But history suggests otherwise. The Antarctic Treaty is not a monument. It is a living agreement, one that must be defended and renewed by each generation. And perhaps that is its most important lesson, that even in the most remote and inhospitable corner of the planet, the future is never entirely secure, and the choices we make now will echo far longer than the crunch of snow beneath our boots.
Even after the last great age of exploration had ended, after the flags were planted, the maps filled in, and the races for glory had faded into history books, Antarctica did not slip quietly into obscurity. It continued to whisper, or perhaps to roar, to those who had once stood upon its ice, and to those who had only read about it in the dim light of a library. For some, it was a siren's call, the promise of being in a place almost entirely untouched by humanity, where the rules of the rest of the world no longer seemed to apply. For others, it was a test, a question carved into the wind. How far are you willing to go to know yourself?
The men and women who return to Antarctica today are not in search of blank spaces on a map. GPS satellites have stripped away that kind of mystery. Nor are they always chasing personal fame. Their names will not be carved into monuments like those of Scott or Amundsen. Instead, they are drawn by something less tangible, something perhaps even more compelling. The desire to stand in a place that is almost defiantly indifferent to human life, and to understand what that indifference can teach us.
For scientists, Antarctica offers an unparalleled laboratory. Beneath its ice sheets lie climate records stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, trapped in bubbles of ancient air. By drilling ice cores, researchers can read these frozen archives and trace the rise and fall of atmospheric carbon, the swings between ice ages and warmer periods, and the long, slow rhythms of the planet's natural cycles. On its rocky coasts and in its frigid seas, life has adapted in astonishing ways, from penguins that can survive blizzards by huddling in tight circles, to fish with antifreeze proteins in their blood, to tiny microorganisms that endure in brine trapped beneath the ice. Each discovery expands our understanding not only of Antarctica, but of life itself.
And yet, the pull is not purely scientific. There is an emotional and even philosophical magnetism to Antarctica, one that has drawn back those who swore they would never return. Former expedition members speak of it in the same way mountaineers speak of Everest, as something unfinished, a chapter that refuses to close. They remember the way the air felt so dry and sharp it seemed to slice each breath. They remember the endless daylight of summer when the sun refused to set, and the opposite, the all-consuming darkness of winter, when time seemed to fold in on itself. They remember the silence, a silence so deep that it became a physical presence, as if the ice itself were listening.
This allure comes with a cost. Antarctica is not generous even to those who love it. Modern expeditions, though far better equipped than their historical counterparts, still face dangers that technology cannot erase. Storms can appear with almost no warning, reducing visibility to nothing within minutes. Temperatures can plummet to the point where exposed skin freezes in seconds. The sheer isolation, thousands of kilometers from the nearest city, days from rescue, even by air, imposes a psychological weight that is difficult to describe. To work here is to accept that you live at the mercy of forces that do not care if you succeed or fail, live or die. And still they come. Scientists from over 30 nations maintain research stations year-round, braving months of darkness to collect data that might help predict future sea level rise, map the shifting ice sheets, or track the fragile web of life in the Southern Ocean. Filmmakers and writers travel south to capture its stark beauty, knowing that no camera can truly replicate the experience of being there. Even tourists, bundled in layers of synthetic insulation, venture by ship to its fringes, eager to stand on a shore where the only footprints might be their own.
Why? Perhaps because in a world where so much is already known, owned, and altered, Antarctica offers the rare gift of humility. It reminds us that we are small, fragile creatures, not masters of the planet, but temporary visitors. It strips away the illusions of control that we build our daily lives upon, replacing them with something rawer, more honest. You cannot negotiate with the wind here. You cannot bargain with the cold. You can only prepare, endure, and, if you are lucky, witness something extraordinary before it swallows you back into its silence.
There is also the undeniable weight of legacy. The names of early explorers, some celebrated, others nearly forgotten, linger over every snowfield and mountain pass. Standing on the ice, you can imagine the ghostly outlines of their tents, half buried in drifts. Hear the muffled crunch of sled runners. See the frost clinging to the beards of men who knew they might never return. Each modern expedition, no matter how advanced, feels like a continuation of that story, another verse in a long and unfinished ballad. The Antarctic does not belong to any one generation. It is inherited, cared for, and, if the treaty holds, passed along intact to those yet to come.
And so the call continues. It is not always loud. Sometimes it is little more than a memory resurfacing on a warm summer day thousands of kilometers away. The sudden, inexplicable recollection of the way ice crystals glitter in moonlight, or the strange blue of a crevasse that seems to glow from within. Other times, it is a compulsion that cannot be ignored, a need to go back, to see if the continent has changed, or if it is the traveler who has.
Antarctica is a place of extremes, but it is also a place of constants. The wind will always scour its plateaus. The ice will always shift and groan in its slow journey to the sea. And for as long as people know it exists, there will be those who cannot resist answering its call, even knowing that the price may be high, even knowing that the ice takes far more than it ever gives.
Because in the end, the call of Antarctica is not just the lure of a place. It is the lure of the unknown, the reminder that there are still frontiers, not just on maps, but within ourselves, waiting to be faced. And sometimes that is enough to pull a person across oceans, through storms, into the heart of the coldest, most remote place on earth, simply to stand there, listening, as the wind carries a message only they can hear.
So now, as the last echoes of boots on snow fade into the long stillness, we leave Antarctica behind. Not conquered, not tamed, simply visited. The stories of flags and firsts dissolve into the larger, older truth that the ice was here before us and will be here long after we are gone. We have walked in the tracks of those who came seeking glory and of those who came seeking knowledge. We have felt the cold that humbled kings of ambition and the silence that swallowed their names. And we have seen that beneath all the human drama, the continent moves to a rhythm of its own, slow, patient, unmoved by victory or loss.
Perhaps that is its greatest gift, to stand in a place that does not need us, and yet allows us, briefly, to be part of its story. A place that reminds us how small we are, and how vast the world can still be. And as we turn away, the ice does not call for applause. It does not ask to be remembered. It simply continues, wind over snow, shadow over ridge, night over sea, waiting as it always has for the next traveler to arrive and listen. Good night.